Hello, today I'm going to be talking about equations with absolute value. This is for an intermediate algebra class. My name is Tuesday J. Johnson. I'm an assistant professor at Doña Ana Community College and a lecturer at the University of Texas, El Paso. Intermediate algebra is Math 120 at Doña Ana Community College and New Mexico State University. This corresponds to Chapter 2 of Turner-McKeague's Intermediate Algebra, Equations and Inequalities in One Variable. Specifically, equations with absolute value, section 2.6. So absolute value equations. For any algebraic expression A and positive constant B, if the absolute value of A is equal to B, then either A equals B or A equals negative B. Remember, the absolute value is a distance, and distance is always positive. So we don't know if the input was positive or negative to start with because the absolute value itself makes the result non-negative. Quick little examples here. If the absolute value of x equals 7, then x equals 7 or x equals negative 7. If the absolute value of y equals negative 4, look, it said the constant b has to be positive. There's no solution, and we're going to talk about that one here in a couple of minutes. Even if 5 equals the absolute value of a, it doesn't matter which side the absolute value is on, then 5 equals a or negative 5 equals a. All right, so that's all it is. Absolute value, the two lines, gives us two equations to solve. So some steps on how to solve an absolute value equation. First, isolate the absolute value on one side of the equation. So we'll use the addition property of equality to peel things away, and then we'll use the multiplication property of equality for equations to peel more things away, get the absolute value on one side of the equation by itself. And this is a great first step for most of the things that we're going to solve for. If the constant on the other side of the equation is positive, we'll proceed to step 3. If it's 0 or negative, we have a special case. So, if b equals 0, solve the equation without absolute values, because 0 doesn't have a positive and negative. It's the only number that we have that doesn't have two possibilities, right? It's only one, so we just solve it. But if b is less than 0, this equation has no solution, and that's what we saw on the previous slide, right? The absolute value of y equals negative 4, no solution, because a distance can't be negative. Step 3, use the property of absolute value equations to write two equations that do not involve an absolute value. Solve for the variable in the resulting two equations, and always check your solutions in the original equation. Let's do some examples. If the absolute value of y plus 3 equals 1, our first step will be to isolate. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides of the equation. I'll have absolute value of y on the left. 1 minus 3 gives me negative 2. And I know that when the absolute value is isolated, if it's equal to a negative value, there will be no solution. I stop here. If the absolute value of a plus 2 equals 7/3, notice that the absolute value is already isolated. The absolute value is equal to a positive number, so 7/3 is positive. So I'm just going to use the property that says the absolute value of a plus 2 equals 7/3 when a plus 2 equals 7/3 or a plus 2 equals negative 7/3. Right? We don't know if the result was positive or if the result was negative, but the absolute value changed it to a distance. You can solve these two. Subtract 2 from both sides. 7/3 minus 2. We need a common denominator to subtract fractions. 2 is the same as 6/3. So 7/3 minus 6/3 equals 1/3. First answer. Or if a plus 2 equals negative 7/3 and I subtract 2, then a equals negative 7/3 minus 2. That's negative 7/3 minus 6/3, and we'll call that a negative 13/3. Remember, we don't need mixed numbers. Mixed numbers, that's for baking and carpentry. We're doing math. Improper fractions are just fine. So our answers will be 1/3 and negative 13/3. If the absolute value of 3/4 x minus 6 equals 9, then the absolute value is isolated. The 9 is positive, so we can solve using the absolute value properties. We write two equations, right? Absolute value has two lines, turns into two equations. 3/4 x minus 6 equals 9. Or 3/4 x minus 6 equals negative 9. Let's take it one at a time. I'm going to add 6 to both sides. In green, I have 3/4 x equals 15. Now, normally we divide at this step, divide by whatever's in front of the x, right? The coefficient. But when it's a fraction, rather than dividing by a fraction, we will frequently multiply both sides by the reciprocal. 4/3 times 3/4. What is that? That's 12 over 12, which makes 1. So multiplying by the reciprocal on both sides will also isolate our variable. 15 times 4 is 60. 60 divided by 3 gives us x equals 20. Don't forget to solve your second equation. I know after all that work you think you're finished. That's why I write the two of them first, so I don't forget to go back and solve the second one later. Add 6 to both sides. 3/4 x equals negative 3. Multiply both sides by 4/3. On the left I'll have x. That's why I multiplied by 4/3. And on the right, negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. Negative 12 divided by 3 is negative 4. If you see the simpler way of canceling in order to get that answer, fantastic. Either way, your answers are 20 and negative 4. If the absolute value of 8 minus 6x equals 0, we have the absolute value isolated. Fantastic. This is a special case where b equals 0, so we solve the equation without absolute values. 8 minus 6x equals 0. In this case, I'm going to add 6x to both sides. If 8 equals 6x, I'm going to divide both sides by 6. X equals 8/6, but we will always reduce our fractions to lowest terms. So 8/6 is the same as 4/3. This is a special case. It only has one answer because 0 is neither positive nor negative, but it's kind of both. Alright, so everything's been isolated so far. Let's do some work. 2 plus the absolute value of 2x minus 6 equals 10. First step, always isolate. So let's subtract 2 from both sides. The absolute value of 2x minus 6 equals 8. Isolated. Fantastic. 8 is a positive value. That tells me that I can write my two equations. 2x minus 6 equals 8, or 2x minus 6 equals negative 8. Write both of them right away. That way you don't get lost in your work and just move on. Write both of them so you know you have to solve two equations. 2x minus 6 equals 8. I'm going to add 6 to both sides. If 2x equals 14, I can divide both sides by 2 and get x equals 7. In my second equation, if I add 6 to both sides, 2x equals negative 2. Divide both sides by 2. X equals negative 1, and there we have our two answers. Solving absolute value equations. Isolate, use the property, watch for special cases. Don't forget to solve two equations when your b value is positive.